David Carter stood by the large window in his living room, sipping his morning coffee while gazing out at the vast field behind his house. It was a peaceful sight, the golden hues of autumn stretching endlessly under a sky brushed with soft, white clouds. Yet, something had disturbed that tranquility. For the past week, Max, their loyal Labrador, had taken to barking relentlessly at the same spot in the field every morning. It wasn't his usual territorial warning or the excited barking when he spotted a rabbit. No, this was different, urgent, almost insistent, as if he sensed something just beyond human perception. Sarah had dismissed it as nothing more than an animal's instinct, perhaps reacting to the scent of another creature, maybe a fox or a stray cat. She had suggested as she poured cereal into Emma's bowl. But David wasn't convinced. There was an odd determination in the way Max returned to the same patch of land. Sniffing, pawing, and barking with an intensity that made David uneasy. Finally, curiosity got the better of him. One crisp morning, with the sun barely breaking through the mist, David grabbed a shovel from the shed and made his way to the field. Max bounded ahead, tail wagging, but the moment they reached the spot, he resumed his agitated barking. David knelt and pressed his hand against the ground. The earth felt soft, recently disturbed, not like the rest of the hardened soil. Something was buried here. With slow, deliberate strokes, he began digging, the rich brown soil crumbling away under his hands. After several minutes, the tip of the shovel struck something solid, a wooden box. Weathered and worn with time, the wood was damp, its edges softened by decades underground. But it was still intact. David carefully lifted it out of the hole and brushed away the dirt. Max, now silent, sat beside him, ears perked, watching with intense curiosity. Back inside the house, he placed the box on the kitchen table. Sarah, who had just finished packing Emma's lunch, raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" "I don't know," David admitted, taking a knife to pry open the rusted latch. The lid creaked as it lifted, releasing a faint musty scent, the unmistakable aroma of something long forgotten. Inside, carefully wrapped in delicate cloth, were old letters tied with a faded ribbon, a black and white photograph, and a small locket. Sarah peered over his shoulder. "Letters?" she murmured, reaching for the top one. David unfolded the fragile paper carefully, his fingers grazing the ink that had faded but remained legible. The handwriting was elegant, neat, belonging to someone who had taken great care with their words. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "every night, I close my eyes and see your face. This war keeps me away from you. But in my heart, I am always home. One day, I will stand in front of our house again. And you will be there, waiting for me. Until then, know that I love you with all that I am. Yours forever, James." David exhaled slowly, exchanging glances with Sarah. "Eleanor?" he whispered. "That name sounds familiar." Sarah nodded. She was the previous owner. "Well, before the Thompsons bought this place. I remember the realtor mentioning her." David turned his attention to the photograph. It was of a young woman standing in front of their house. wearing a simple dress, her hands clasped in front of her. She had soft curls framing her face and eyes filled with something hopeful. Something wistful. Eleanor. He picked up the locket, opening it gently. Inside was the image of a soldier in uniform. The name etched on the back read James Holloway. He must have buried this here, Sarah said quietly, tracing the edge of the locket with her fingertips. But why? David leaned back in his chair, thinking, maybe she never got the letters. A heavy silence settled between them. The thought was both tragic and possible. If James had sent these letters but Eleanor never received them, had she waited for him in vain? Had she spent her days longing for someone who never returned? That night, David found himself staring at the old photograph long after Sarah and Emma had gone to bed. The past had a way of leaving behind whispers, echoes of lives once lived, of love once cherished. Somewhere, long ago, James Holloway had written to a woman he loved, hoping against all odds to come back to her. And here, in this very house, Eleanor had once stood, waiting. David knew he couldn't leave it at that. He had to find out what had happened to them. And so, the mystery of the letters, the soldier, and the woman who had once lived in his home began to unfold. David sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letters spread before him. The ink had faded, but the emotions in each carefully chosen word remained clear. James Holloway had been a soldier, a man in love, writing to a woman named Eleanor. But what had happened to them? Why had these letters never reached her? Why had they been buried in the field instead? Sarah, sitting beside him, was just as absorbed. She carefully turned the fragile pages, reading through each line with quiet reverence. He was stationed in Europe, she murmured, pointing to one of the letters. He mentions France and the long days marching through unfamiliar villages. He wrote about how much he missed Eleanor, how he dreamed of coming home. Emma, listening intently, frowned. If he loved her that much, why didn't he come back? It was the question neither David nor Sarah could answer. I think it's time we find out, David said. There has to be a record of him somewhere. The next morning, after dropping Emma off at school, David and Sarah drove into town to visit the local archives. The building was old, its walls lined with shelves filled with decades of records, dusty books, and historical documents. A librarian, a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and an eager smile, greeted them. "What can I help you with?" David hesitated before explaining the discovery. "We found some old letters buried in our field. They were written by a soldier named James Holloway to a woman named Eleanor, who lived in our house during the 1940s. We want to know what happened to them." The librarian's eyes lit up with interest. "That's quite the story," she said, leading them to a set of records stored on microfilm. "Let's see what we can find." It took over an hour of searching. But eventually, Sarah gasped. "Here, Eleanor sold the house in 1944. David leaned in, reading the document carefully. That was during the war. If she sold it then, she must have thought James wasn't coming back. A heavy silence hung between them. It made sense. If James had been declared missing or worse, Eleanor might have decided to leave. unable to bear the weight of waiting any longer. But something still didn't add up. If she thought he was gone, why were the letters buried instead of delivered to her? Sarah shook her head. Maybe someone else hid them. Maybe there was more to the story. Determined to find answers, they dug deeper into military records. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. James Holloway had been declared missing in action in 1944. During a battle in France. His name was listed among the thousands of soldiers whose fate had never been confirmed. So she must have thought he died. David murmured. Sarah traced a finger over the document. And maybe he did. But that lingering doubt remained. If James had been lost in the war, how had his letters ended up buried in their field? A thought struck David. What if he came back? Sarah looked at him sharply. But if he came back, why didn't he find Eleanor? Why didn't they reunite? David didn't have an answer. But he knew they were missing a crucial part of the story. We need to find someone who remembers them. That night, as David lay awake, his mind raced with possibilities. Had James survived only to return home too late? Had Eleanor already moved on? Or had something else happened? Something no one ever spoke about. The past had left its echoes in their home. And now those echoes demanded to be heard. He would not stop until he knew the truth. David could not shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something important. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together. But there was still a gap. A missing link between what had happened to James Holloway and why his letters had remained buried for decades. The more he and Sarah searched, the more it became clear that Eleanor had not simply given up hope. Something had prevented these letters from reaching her. And the biggest question still remained. Had James truly died in the war? Or was there another explanation? Their search led them deeper into military archives, beyond the town's records and into national databases. It was in a digitized file from the Department of Veterans Affairs that Sarah finally found something that made her breath catch. "David," she said, barely above a whisper, "he didn't die." David leaned over her shoulder, scanning the document. The details were shocking. James Holloway had been reported missing in action in 1944. But what had never been widely known was that he had been found months later, severely wounded, in a field hospital in France. He had survived but suffered from traumatic brain injury and memory loss. Without any identification on him and unable to recall his name, he had been transferred to a long-term military hospital in Paris, where he remained until he slowly began recovering fragments of his past. It wasn't until 1950 that James had finally regained enough of his memory to be properly identified. By then, the world had moved on. His unit had been disbanded. Official records listed him as missing for years. And when he finally returned to his hometown, Eleanor was gone. David sat back, running a hand over his face. He survived, but he came back too late. Sarah shook her head, her expression filled with sorrow. And Eleanor must have thought he was gone forever. She sold the house in 1944. She probably waited for as long as she could. They sat in silence, absorbing the weight of it all. The war had not only separated them but had erased their chance of finding each other again. James had come home to an empty place. to a life that no longer existed. And Eleanor, thinking she had lost him, had left without knowing that he had survived. But what had happened to James after that? Where had he gone? The answer came in the form of another document. This one showing a residence change in the early 1950s. James Holloway had relocated to New York City. He started over. Sarah murmured. He had no choice. David nodded. But he must have never forgotten her. Those letters. He must have buried them himself. Maybe as a way of saying goodbye. The thought struck them both deeply. After all he had endured, war, injury, years of lost memory, James had finally come back, only to find that the one person he longed for was gone. And so, perhaps in one final act of closure, he had hidden the letters and the locket, preserving the love that had been lost to time. But their journey didn't end there. While searching for any remaining family connections, Sarah came across a name, Olivia Holloway. The name stood out not just because of the connection to James, but because Olivia, it seemed, had been looking for answers as well. She's his granddaughter, Sarah said excitedly. She's been researching her grandfather's past. Look at this. There's a genealogy forum where she's posted about trying to find information on him. David read the post carefully. Olivia had been trying to trace her grandfather's military records, knowing only fragments of his story. Her grandfather, she wrote, had rarely spoken about his time in the war, but there had always been a sense that something, or someone, had been left behind. David didn't hesitate. He reached out through the forum, explaining what they had found. The letters, the photograph, and the mystery they had been trying to solve. It wasn't long before they received a response. This is incredible. I've been searching for years to understand my grandfather's past. Please, I'd love to talk. Can we meet? A few days later, Olivia arrived at their home. She was in her early 30s. With the same sharp eyes and determined expression that David imagined James might have had in his youth. She listened intently as David and Sarah recounted everything, the letters, the buried box, the records they had uncovered. When they showed her the photograph of Eleanor, her breath caught. I've never seen this before, she murmured, tracing the image gently with her fingers. He never spoke about anyone from before the war. But I always felt like he carried something with him. Some kind of loss. She turned the locket over in her hand, her expression softening. He wore one just like this. I never knew where it came from. Sarah reached across the table, her voice gentle. He must have loved her very much. Olivia nodded. I think he did. Even after he started a new life. I think a part of him was still searching for her. The weight of the past settled between them all. It was a story that had taken decades to unravel. One of love lost not by choice but by cruel circumstance. And yet, even in that loss, James had held on to something. He had never let go of Eleanor entirely. As the evenings stretched on, Olivia smiled through her tears. Thank you, she said softly, for helping me find this part of him. For giving him back a piece of his story. David looked out toward the field, where it had all begun. The letters had been buried, but they had not been forgotten. And now, at last, the truth had been brought to light. The air was crisp as David and Sarah sat across from Olivia in their cozy living room. The letters spread between them like fragile pieces of history waiting to be understood. Olivia traced the edges of one with delicate fingers. Her eyes filled with wonder and emotion. "I can't believe these were his," she whispered, lifting one of the letters. "He never talked about this part of his life. But I always knew there was something." David and Sarah exchanged a glance before Sarah spoke gently. "He never forgot her." Olivia exhaled shakily. "That makes sense. My grandfather always kept an old photograph with him. I saw it once when I was a child. It was tucked inside his wallet, folded so many times that it was nearly falling apart. When I asked him who she was, he just smiled and said, 'Someone I once knew.'" She swallowed hard, looking back at the letters. "I think I finally know who that someone was." A heavy silence settled over the room as the weight of the past filled the space between them. James had survived, had rebuilt his life, but his heart had never truly left the woman he had lost. And Eleanor? What had become of her? Had she ever known he had returned? Had she moved on? Or had she spent her days wondering about the man who had once promised to come back? Max, who had been quietly curled up by the door, suddenly perked up, his ears twitching. Then, without warning, he stood and padded toward the back door, looking over his shoulder as if expecting them to follow. Sarah frowned. "Not again." David pushed himself up, watching as the dog whined and pawed at the door. "I think he wants to show us something." Without hesitation, the three of them grabbed their coats and stepped outside, following Max as he trotted toward the same field where the letters had been found. The air was colder now, the wind whispering through the tall grass. Max stopped at a spot a little farther out than before, circling before digging at the earth with urgency. David's heart pounded as he knelt and began to help. The soil was softer here, as if it had been disturbed before. Within moments, his hands brushed against something solid. He pulled it out carefully, a rusted tin box, its edges worn with age. Olivia crouched beside him as he slowly pried it open. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, was a single letter. The paper was yellowed, its edges brittle, but the handwriting was unmistakable. James Holloway. With trembling hands, Olivia unfolded the letter. Her voice was barely more than a whisper as she read, "Eleanor, I have come back, but you are gone. The house is empty, the echoes of your laughter replaced by silence. I searched for you, but no one knew where you had gone. I tell myself that you are happy somewhere, that life was kind to you, even if fate was not kind to us. I will not leave another letter here, for there is no one to read it. But if, by some miracle, you ever return, know this: I never stopped loving you. I never forgot. If I could have found you, I would have. And if you still remember me, even as a whisper, then that is enough. James." The words hung in the air, each sentence pressing against their hearts like a weight too heavy to bear. Olivia clutched the letter to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks. "He came back," she choked out. "He came back for her." David swallowed hard, his throat tight. "And she wasn't here." Sarah brushed a tear from her own eye, her voice soft. "He must have buried this himself. Maybe he hoped, in some way, that she would find it. Olivia nodded, her expression a mixture of sorrow and understanding. All these years, he carried this with him. I always knew there was something he never let go of. But now I understand. She exhaled, a slow, shaky breath. He loved her until the very end. They sat in silence for a long moment, the wind rustling through the field, carrying with it the echoes of a love that had spanned decades, even as time had tried to erase it. Finally, Olivia spoke, her voice steadier. "Thank you," she said, looking at David and Sarah with genuine gratitude. "For finding this. For helping me understand my grandfather in a way I never could before." David gave her a small, sad smile. He wanted this to be remembered. Maybe. In some way. This is his final message. Olivia held the letter carefully, nodding, "I think it is." As they stood there in the fading light, a sense of peace settled over them. The past had finally spoken. James Holloway had returned, even if too late. But now, at last, his story had been told. The morning air was crisp as David, Sarah, Emma, and Olivia made their way through the quiet cemetery, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The trees lining the path swayed gently, their golden leaves rustling in the wind, as if whispering secrets from the past. In Sarah's hands were the letters, carefully wrapped in cloth, and in Olivia's, the photograph of Eleanor, the woman who had once stood in front of the house with hope in her eyes, waiting for a man who had promised to return. Max trotted beside them, his tail wagging slightly, but his demeanor was calmer than usual, as if sensing the weight of the moment. It was he who had led him to the first box, who had uncovered the past. And now, it felt only right that he was here for the final step of their journey. Eleanor's grave was modest, marked by a simple headstone with her name and the years of her life. Eleanor May Thompson, 1921 to 1998. She had lived a full life, though they did not know where or with whom. But what they did know, and what had brought them here today, was that she had once loved a man named James Holloway, and he had never stopped loving her in return. Olivia knelt first, running her fingers over the engraved letters of Eleanor's name, her expression a mixture of sadness and peace. "She never knew," she whispered. "She never knew he came back." David crouched beside her, placing the bundle of letters gently on the ground. "Maybe. In some way. She does now." He took a deep breath, glancing at Sarah, who nodded in silent agreement. With care, Olivia unfolded the final letter, the one James had buried in the field, the one he had written when he realized Eleanor was gone. She read it again, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "Eleanor, I have come back, but you are gone. The house is empty, the echoes of your laughter replaced by silence. I searched for you, but no one knew where you had gone. I tell myself that you are happy somewhere, that life was kind to you, even if fate was not kind to us. I will not leave another letter here, for there is no one to read it. But if, by some miracle, you ever return, know this: I never stopped loving you. I never forgot. If I could have found you, I would have. And if you still remember me, even as a whisper, then that is enough." James. Tears slipped down Olivia's cheeks. And she gently placed the letter against Eleanor's gravestone. "You were loved," she whispered. "You were never forgotten." Sarah wiped her own eyes as Emma, who had been standing quietly, stepped forward. "She must have been happy," the little girl said softly. "She lived a long time." David nodded. "I think she did, but I also think that somewhere, in the back of her mind, she might have always wondered." They stood in silence for a long moment, letting the weight of the past settle. The love story of James and Eleanor had not ended the way it was meant to. But it had endured. It had been buried, waiting to be discovered, and now, at last, it had been given its rightful place in history. Sarah exhaled, looking over at David. "We should write this down," she said. "Their story. It shouldn't just disappear again." David smiled softly, already knowing that she was right. "We will." Olivia nodded, her fingers still resting on the gravestone. "I want to make sure my family knows," she said, "so that James isn't just a name in our history but a person. Someone who lived and loved." Emma tilted her head. "Can we put the letters in a book?" Sarah smiled, brushing Emma's hair back. "That's a wonderful idea." Max, who had been sitting quietly, suddenly laid down beside Eleanor's grave, his head resting on his paws. It was as if he, too, understood that this was where the journey ended, that the past had finally found its way home. David chuckled softly, rubbing the dog's ears. "Looks like Max thinks so too." The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves, and for a moment, they could almost believe that somewhere, somehow, James and Eleanor were watching. That even though they had not found their way back to each other in life, their love had never truly been lost. It had waited, buried beneath the earth, carried in the heart of a man who never stopped searching. And now, through the hands of strangers who had become something more, it had been given its rightful place. As they turned to leave, Olivia glanced back one last time. "Goodbye, Grandpa," she murmured. "I hope you found peace." And with that, they walked away, the past no longer forgotten, but remembered forever.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.